When I was younger, I was the one who indulged in music parties and various intoxicating substances that would enhance those experiences. I count myself among many who were allowed to hide their hedonism to run wild with enthusiasm. It came then as no surprise that I found myself attending festivals with groups of friends who at the time shared the same reckless mindset as me. For the record, and I say this without pride, I am an experienced in drug taking. While I don't practically regret it, there were one experience that halted my drug use altogether. At the time, my fellow partygoers scoffed at this decision, since I didn't see any worth trying to explain to them what had happened. They would most likely have chalked it all up into substance-induced hallucination. I have had such hallucinations in the past, which tend to be a result of my sleep deprivation and frequent redosing. I can safely say none of them compared to the new raw reality of this experience. It was the start of summer, and my friend Rachel had informed me that the group of them were heading to an EDM festival couple states over. I'll refrain from divulging the location, as I feel I've already revealed too much, by specifying my home country, but I was quick to take up the invitation. Hastily, I booked a ticket from the third batch release and began making preparations for the trip. It was a 3-day weekend festival, so tents and other supplies were required. Of course, I was already prepared with all the required equipment. The festival was most certainly not being my first. I'll spare you the long car ride journey to the location, but we could barely contain ourselves. With me were my buddies Chris, Robbie, and of course Rachel. We hadn't been to this one, and we were vigorously discussed many topics, including how we were going to smuggle our pills and powders. I myself opted to bring MDMA powder, often coined as ecstasy in pill form, and a few LSD bottlers, planning to candy flip for the duration. I stuck to the ever-true blabalzing method, which is exactly it sounds, stuffing your bags into your boxers before going through security. For people like us, the place was pretty much nirvana. It was set up in a rural area bordering hilly woodland on one side. At least a dozen enormous festival tents were set up in a semicircular fashion, all playing EDM, but with different artists in lineup paradise at the time. The day went by in a blur. I was quick dose up the MDMA, which kept me dancing through 8 hours of bliss. I don't recommend redosing, but damn if it wasn't hard to avoid when everyone around you is just doing that. Pure pressure and at its finest. We joined with another group of mind-like individuals by the end of the day, and we decided we'd camp together. Robbie had the wonderful idea to have a campfire, but with the rules and regulations we have to go somewhere elsewhere, a little more removed. We decided to pack up our tents and move it over to the woods that bordered the property. I was skeptical at the first, but we came across a really nice spot at the top of a hill, from which the terrain descended and gave us a clear view of the tree tops across this forest. Pretty much the perfect spot to watch a fiery sunset commonly associated with the summer evenings, with it also being out of the eye and earshot from any uptight security personnel. After setting up our tents, drinking began without hesitation. The sun was getting low, and I felt great, despite the onset of a come-down headed my way. We were able to gather up twigs and sticks fairly quickly, being in a forest, and use spent beer packaging to get the fire going. "Hey, want a bump?" Chris said, who I was sitting next to on a fallen log near a campfire. He offered me a bag of shardy powder, which I immediately recognized as ketamine. How could I have refused? It was such a pure perfect moment, I couldn't put it down, the little disassociation. "You even have to ask?" A wide grin grew on his face as he pulled out his car keys to scoop the powder. He sniffed in a generous heap of the stuff before handing it to me. I crushed the bag a little, something Chris had forgotten to do beforehand. When he took out the miniature snow-covered mountain, practically inhaled it. I tasted the drip a little, but it wasn't so bad in comparison to what I had been consuming earlier in the day. I felt it immediately. Whoa, holy shit, dude. Feels like something they'd tranquilize a fucking rhino with, I said, words already becoming jumbled and merged together. I know, right? Didn't even open it earlier. Been saving it for now. Robbie eagle-eyed intoxications, practically teleported into the log next to Chris. Probably just a side effect of the drugs, but this sudden manifestation caused me and Chris to erupt in laughter. Robbie acted jokingly offended this. Didn't know there was an insomnia that made you turn into an asshole, he chuckled. Yeah, it's called a dickhead anime, Chris said, barely containing his giggles. Well, I'm feeling a little too respectful right now. Mind sharing? Of course, Chris replied, passing the paraphernalia to Robbie. Just then, another different feeling swept over me. It wasn't a feeling of nausea or anxiety, but it was like late in the day sunlight was coming in pulses, like I could never feel the rays, as if they had weight and substance to them, increasing and decreasing intensively as they swept across my face. I never felt anything like this type of drug before, so at the time I thought it was just a combination of whatever chemicals were coursing through my veins, and that moment, tripping out, as one might call it. I chose to dismiss it and continue partying. Someone from the other group had brought out their speaker, a heavy and chunky thing that blasted bass into our bones. With the others dancing about the camp, I opted that the one final redose of MDMA couldn't hurt. I'm not sure how long I flailed about joy for, but when I went to sit down and log for a breather, the horizon was already burning with a deep orange. Need a cold one? Asked Robbie, who somehow pulled off the same teleportation trick from earlier. Well, shit, dude, you got me again. Just a few of my natural skills. Want one or not? Yeah, crack me one, I gasped, with the exhaustion from the day finally catching up to me. Robbie opened a can and handed it to me. Thought it wasn't as cold as he promised. We sat there chatting for a while, gazing over the filtering eaves and below which reflected the dusk light. It felt serene, and I knew the money spent, not wasted. I became distracted at some point with a barely audible sound, somewhere off in the distance again. I thought nothing of it. I wasn't a stranger to the hallucinations brought after the heavy drug use, and I had seen much worse, but the sound wasn't diminishing after some time, so I strained my ears to see if I could make out anything in particular. A light breeze had picked up, which made it more difficult, but after a short while I could definitely make something out. Machinery. That was the first word that came to my mind in an attempt to describe what I was hearing. The heavy clanking and whirling of fuel-powered mechanisms operating on a building site. I didn't even notice Robbie's absence at this point until I looked over and saw there were only a few of us outside now. Two making out messily, and Chris and Robbie still dancing. I sat and listened for a few minutes. I could swear that the sounds were getting closer, but they were still too distant to be certain. I checked the time, and then I became a little confused. 10 p.m. I glanced back up the sky. The sun hadn't even touched the horizon yet, but the sky around definitely had grown darker, with stars becoming apparent. I thought rose into my mind. This shit has me tripping. This was absolutely true, but the whole situation just seemed wrong in some way. At that moment, I shifted my gaze downwards to see Rachel standing below on the slope of the hill, facing away from the camp, squinting in confusion. I called out, "Hey, Rach, that you? What are you doing down here?" There was no response, not even a flicker of movement to suggest she'd register my call. I grew concerned, thinking that she'd taken too much. I heaved myself up off the log to go and help her back up the hill. Rachel was standing in the strangest posture. Her shoulders were slumped so low like they had been dislocated, and her head lolled backwards. I picked up the pace a bit, growing more worried at her condition. When all of my carelessness I caught my foot on a root protruding from the dirt. I tripped head over heels almost comedically and rolled down to the bottom of the hill in a tumble of dust and twigs. Luckily, it wasn't too high or steep, but it was far enough that upon looking back up, the firefly was but a faint orange haze which leaked over the brim of the hill. I was too shaken to realize at first, but after observing my surroundings, I could see that Rachel was nowhere to be found. Surely she wasn't so fucked up as not to notice the mess that I was rolling right past her. But then where was she? No one stood above me and on the slope, and I couldn't see anyone else around me. I realized then that was one of those stupid come down hallucinations. I was pissed, seeing my white trainers now coated in the fine layer of brown dust, along with the rest of my clothing. Still, even with the realization, I found it a little comfort sitting on my ass alone in a quickly darkening forest. I picked myself up off the ground and dusted my own body down, but before turning to make my way back to the camp, something caught my eye. The trees now blocked much of the sky, but the sun was still there, seemingly in the exact same place as earlier. From somewhere beyond the tree line above, there was these lines, reaching upwards towards the sun, very thin and barely visible, but they became more apparent the longer I last stared. They moved in an almost peculiar way, like hanging cables or tubes under the influence of gravity, swaying in curved arcs, terminating at the sun's edge. I wasn't so quick to credit this some sort of crazy visuals. However, I looked in on curiosity as more and more of those tubes began again attaching themselves to the sun. The sun was much brighter now. It was a dim orange previously, as sunsets tend to be, but now it looked more like it would during dawn, almost dazzlingly bright. I thought it taken a faint blush hue, but the drugs messing with my visual processing, I didn't dwell on that idea long. I willed myself up to turn away and head back up the hill. My friends were probably worried with me gone, though they could equally have been completely unaware of my disappearance. I crawled back up to the top only to see Chris and Robbie sitting near the dimming campfire. My knee fell and snapped a twig, leading Chris to look over at the noise. He visibly jumped when he saw me, then fell back into confusion as he glanced between me and Robbie, waiting for someone to speak. "What?" I shouted over, unsure of what had them in such bewilderment. Man, stop fucking around. I thought you were some homeless dude or something," Chris said, letting out a sigh of relief after understanding the situation. "What are you talking about? I went down there to get Rachel. Wait, where is Rachel?" "She went to bed like 20 minutes ago, and you turned like an hour ago," said Robbie. "What, Robbie? I've been down in the forest for I checked my watch. 12 a.m. 2 hours? Chris and Robbie didn't reply, instead of looking between each other with a tinge of fear. Without a word, Chris stood and walked over to my tent, which upon opening found to be empty. "What the fuck? We both saw you go into your tent and zip it up," Chris exclaimed, worried evident in his tone. "Man, I think we're all just real fuck up." I laughed dry of humor. They grunted in agreement, but I couldn't help but think of what Chris just said. They both hallucinated my likeness, but at the same time? "Hey, Tay, you alright? You're sweating buckets," said Robbie, and he hurled a bottle of water in my direction. "You haven't forgotten about hydration, have you?" Now that he said, I strangely felt hot. I grabbed the bottle and downed it in a few seconds. Before I stood back up and walked over to the communal log bench, we didn't talk much after that, but instead hit Robbie's bong a few times to calm the nerves. Stupidly, it hadn't occurred to me at the time to ask if they also saw what I saw. I was simply too enamored by the situation. Both of them went to bed after that, but I told them I wanted to sit outside a bit longer to relax. The relaxation didn't come, though. To my dismay, the sun still hasn't set, refusing to budge from its perch above the horizon, and I could again hear those mechanical sounds from earlier, echoing across the valley. There was no doubt in this time. They were louder, clearer, which logically meant that whatever was producing the sounds had moved closer. I was still under the impression of some grand hallucination when I heard a voice. No, that doesn't do it justice. I couldn't make out any words, but I somehow knew inherently that I heard a voice amongst the distant changing, not as separate entity, but as if the industrial soundscape was synchronizing itself in such a way that the combined din formed a low metallic voice. Again, no words were apparent. Instead, a distorted mumbling that rang between my ears. I noticed then just the most bizarre sight yet. Despite the obvious abnormality of the pale sun hanging in the dead of night, I looked closer to see the faint lines drifting onto its surface, forming an array of patterns which are slightly dimmer than the rest of the sun. Focusing more intensely now, it was, how do I even describe it? I tripped countless times before, but it looked nothing like the colors swirling visuals I was used to. It was like I was looking at an enormous infinity complex fractal, unfolding in writhing patterns of brighter and dimmer light. The longer I stared, the further the noises synchronized themselves, building until I undoubtedly heard the words, "This one." It sounded so articulated. There was no way my mind had just conjured up from the random combination of sounds. It then came in waves, like an underlying intentness, wavering intensively in such a way to form the exact words. The sky was now a black ocean dotted with its stars, heavily contrasting the intense, cold ball of light I saw before me. The heat was clearly noticeable. Now I found myself wiping sweat out of my eyes to continue looking. I made a decision to smoke some more weed and drink some more beer, in hopes that I could knock myself out and go to sleep. This was all getting too weird, even for a partying vet like myself. I packed a bowl and took a long, slow draw. As much as I didn't want to look, my eyes were magnetized to the concerning sight before me. The squirming lines were wider now, much, much dimmer, more of a dark gray than anything. I rushed down a few beers, and halfway through, my third loud clank made me jump and drop the can to the ground, furrowing my brow as if to ask the world around me just to stop whatever it was doing. I looked up one last time to see the patterns that all seized all movement, and now were almost black. Gaping. To my horror, they began to move again, though the lines remained motionless, but the darkness within was writhing and started to fall. Swaves of tiny black shapes were pouring out of the sun right before my eyes, down to the trees below. At this point, into my drug-induced delusion, my faith in the fact that this was a hallucination was dwindling. They kept pouring out until I could see the trees in the distance starting to shudder, leaves dancing about like a great stampede of something were shaking them. I didn't have the conviction to control myself anymore, and I started hyperventilating. The swaying treetops were getting closer, and the faint, horrible chittering noise became apparent, like how I imagined insects would sound if they were capable of laughter. The tree's movement must have been less than a half a mile away now. I was paralyzed. Whatever I was now in full-fledged delirium or not wasn't my concern at the time. My eyes did not seem to betray me otherwise. Whatever were moving through the trees below were moving fast, and within 20 seconds they were within full earshot. The sounds coming from the darkness became unbearable, like nails scraping my eardrums, and then nothing. Movement ceased and silence fell. The fire still flickered dimly, preventing my eyes from adjusting to the swirling darkness weaving throughout the tree trunks downhill, and the crackling of the embers disturbed by the thick, heavy silence permeating the camp. Suddenly the sound of a twig snapping somewhere to my left broke my petrified state, and my head snapped into the direction it had come from. Rachel stood at the edge of the fire's illumination. No, calling that thing Rachel would be an insult to her very existence. It looked like something with no knowledge of human psychologically, and attempted to rebuild her using her individual body parts, its limbs constantly shifting and readjusting themselves in a fluid manner, like it was trying to correct itself. It took a step forwards, jolting me off the log and onto my back. Rolling backwards, I pushed myself back off the ground, but it had not moved further. Instead, it opened its mouth, or mouths. I couldn't tell how many it had at one time, constantly splitting and merging, combining and creating new holes. I couldn't see anyone inside, just the darkness. It began emitting these vile clicking and ringing noises, which rose and fell, never finding a tone to settle on. And then, just like the sounds before, they started to synchronize into something semi-coherent. Whatever this was didn't seem to be able to copy Rachel's voice. Still, I could not make out any clearer words. Imagine someone who doesn't understand English hearing the language spoken. That is how I felt listening to this abomination, like auditory stroke. It appeared to have given up after another movement, and when quiet, its mouths began instead multiplying, growing and expanding over its skin like Swiss cheese, until nothing that resembled a human remained. My eyes grew painful, trying to focus on whatever stood in my presence. There was nothing in my vocabulary that accurately described the being. I can't really remember how it looked. As hard as I try, the form was just mentally incompatible. I can recall dark lines and dark shapes, both sharp and organic, shifting in certainly more than 3 dimensions. There looked to be about something peering from the spasmic blackness, something like monochrome faces, all overlapping, separate but at the same time as one. They gazed out at me with an expression of intense sorrow, lips parting as if to talk, yet any words were snuffed out by the incomprehensible void. After what felt like hours, but probably seconds, it started to move again, and as it moved, it began to take on a new form. Skin, hair, nails, fabric, all slipping and sliding until the logo on my polo shirt became visible, emerging from underneath the dark fold. While this happened, the movement stirred from the darkness below, countless shifting footsteps disturbing the forest floor. I wish I could describe further and in more detail, but that was the breaking point for me. I dropped the still smoking pipe, spun around, and ran the opposite direction. I ran into the festival grounds past a colorful sea of tents and drunk onlookers before slipping on a cold puddle of someone's vomit and falling face first into the trash-littered ground. I awoke in the medical support tent at 11:30 a.m. Looking down at my arms, they appeared to be terribly sunburnt, and the sight caused the accompanied pain to flare up over my skin. I winced and looked around to absorb my surroundings. A staff member came over to me, and a kind-looking middle-aged man with a bottle of some sort of lotion and another of water. "Hey kid, how are you feeling? You got some terrible burns. Yeah, you forgot your sunscreen?" he asked. Yeah, I lost it somewhere yesterday," I lied. "You gotta be more careful with that, kid. You can get skin cancer from it, you know." "Yeah, thank you. What's that bottle you have here?" "Oh, this? Just something to ease the skin. Trust me, you won't want to leave here without it." The burning that arose, I reached out for the bottle, confirmed this statement. My skin was the color of the sunset, and felt as hot as the sun itself. The thing is, I did put on sunscreen multiple times throughout the day, and I don't burn easily anyway. When we were at the camp, I felt absolutely fine. Well, before whatever happened that made me flee in terror. Chris and Robbie were waiting for me outside, faces carved with somber looks. They had with them all things packed up, tents, leftover drinks, all of it. My heart dropped when they told me that they'd found Rachel's tent empty in the morning along with mine. A search team was called onto the site to scour the wood for any evidence of where she could have gone, but their efforts this far had been fruitless. Though I had a feeling they would not even find the slightest indication that she had ever been there, bar her tent and belongings. Robbie insisted on staying behind to help with the search while Chris and I made our journey home. The leather seats in Chris's car were painfully a nuisance, sticking to my clammy sunburnt and the slightest touch. I don't have the energy to complain though. We arrived back at the house and called Robbie with a dwindling hope, which for me, had already dried up completely, but of course no news had surfaced. Rachel was never found, even after the case was extended to multiple jurisdictions. Any trail that the police may have some sort ran cold. I haven't told my friends, but I know that Rachel is undoubtedly lost forever due to something beyond our comprehension. After all, how could they believe me, given our drug use that night? Grieving is one thing, but grieving knowing you can't tell the truth about what happened is a different beast altogether. While I was changing my clothes that day, I noticed something peculiar. My blue polo no longer held the embroidered brand logo on the left breast it once stood. I still shudder at the implications of what may have happened if I had stuck around any longer to find out. I don't participate in that life anymore. Really, I still see those friends, but on the craziest nights I never go further than drinking or smoking. Usually not in combination. Probably for the best anyway. Those words linger in my head still. This one. Were they referring to me? I really don't have any rational explanation for what happened that night. What were those beings were? Their motives? Needless to say, the image of that pale sun unfolding is forever etched into my memory. All I could say now is that if the sun stops setting and hangs there like a glazed over eye, don't stay to see it opened up. Don't be brave or curious. Just get as far as you can away from whatever you find yourself, or be taken somewhere our minds will never be intended to witness.
What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Ms. Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, please stay pretty.